So today, as you know, we're from the University of St. Thomas, and you are investors who are interested in starting a business in the sharing economy. The sharing economy is a sector in which goods and services are exchanged between individuals. And you have invited us here as a consulting team for you today. Thank you very much for inviting us here today. You asked our team if it is possible to develop a sharing economy business model that is profitable, ethical, and has manageable legal risks. We think this is a great question. My team today includes Mary Brotherson, Allison Cambrone, Keo Chang, and my name is Caitlin Guzik. We hope the presentation we prepared for you will help you to answer this question and also to continue asking good questions as you move forward. Now, consider this. When the automobile was first introduced in the United States, self-propelled vehicles were limited to just 4 miles an hour out of concern that horses would be spooked. The automobile was a piece of disruptive innovation that transformed the transportation industry here in the United States and around the world. Similarly today, the sharing economy is affecting and changing the way that we consume goods and services. Much like with the automobile, the sharing economy is experiencing quite a bit of backlash from established players, from government, and from a variety of stakeholders. Some of the issues involve those traditional competitors. In the example of Uber, taxi cab drivers are frustrated by the lack of regulation that they have to comply with at this time. Other platforms, such as Airbnb, which is a shared lodging service, is under a lot of heat for failure to comply with tax regulations in certain jurisdictions. So the question becomes, in this new sharing economy, is it possible for a business to be profitable as well as having manageable legal risk while being ethical as well? Our team believes that yes, it can, as long as your business adheres to 3 essential principles. The first one is that you want to keep in mind that a sharing economy business is about capturing untapped value that currently exists but isn't being maximized or utilized to its full capacity. Second, in order to manage that legal risk, you'll need to practice self-regulation, keeping in mind the spirit of the existing laws and adhering to those. And finally, as you conduct your business in an ethical manner, you'll need to work very carefully on fostering relationships that are transparent. As long as you follow these 3 guiding principles, we believe that yes, your sharing economy business model will be profitable in the long term as well as in the immediate future. Our presentation today, to start with, we'll be providing an overview of the sharing economy model, highlighting some of the aspects that have made it so successful and have driven valuations for firms like Uber up into the tens of billions of dollars. Second, Mary Brotherson will take you through a business analysis that'll take a deep dive into some of the financial implications. Allison will take you through a legal analysis and bring to your attention some of the areas for concern that the early adopters of this model are currently experiencing. And finally, Keo will take you through some of the ethical ambiguities and so that you can develop a business model that will help you begin with the reputation of integrity that you desire. Now, the sharing economy, as you know, the sharing economy is transforming the way that we consume goods and services, transitioning consumption from a model based on ownership to access. So for this reason, many people refer to the sharing economy as the access economy. Others, particularly cognizant of the of the ambiguities related to employment and employment law, refer to it as the 1099 economy. What really enabled the quick and furious growth of the sharing economy was the 2008 financial crisis. Now, for one thing, consumers were looking for new ways to meet their needs more conveniently and with lower cost. Second, There was also a crisis that occurred at the same time, a crisis of trust, that occurred around the same time that drove people to seek relationships with peers rather than trusting in larger institutions as they had in the past. And this is where that aspect of the sharing economy comes into play, where it's very peer-to-peer. It's about individuals sharing goods with one another. Now, of course, social media and the ubiquitousness of the internet is also a huge part of this. It is what enables the sharing economy to grow, and also it simply facilitates the interaction. So if you have for example, if we're taking Uber as an example again, if you need a ride and I have a car and some extra time on my hands, you can quickly alert me on your smartphone that you have this need and I'm able to fulfill it. And finally, again, a fundamental principle of this is the idea of access over ownership. It's not so much about owning goods and services. We have less of a concern with that. It's more about how can I access this good or this service that I need. We talk about the sharing economy in terms of three basic segments. Now, the first one that I've alluded to a couple times is product service. Uber is the primary example of that. It's valued at over $50 billion, and as it continues its global expansion, many expect that to go up. The second one that we can talk about is collaborative lifestyles. And when we talk about collaborative lifestyles, a key example of this would be Airbnb. This is a shared lodging platform. So if I have an available room and you are visiting the area, you can contact me to rent that room at a rate significantly below that of traditional hotels. And the third market that we can talk about are redistribution markets. Now, the example that we'll be talking about here, which you may not have heard of, actually started out right here in the Boston area. It's called Year Commons, and they were dedicated to facilitating sharing outdoor sporting equipment, kayaks, tents, that sort of thing. As my team proceeds through the analysis of the business, legal, and ethical issues, we'll be taking each of these into account to help clarify the importance of the recommendation that we've already described for you. Another theme you'll notice in these analyses are that we are considering the viability of sharing economy business models from the viewpoint of multiple stakeholders. First, that includes you. As the investors, you are the owners of this business, of course, and your rights and considerations are very important. This also includes thinking about the perspective of your contractors and your employees. We'll be thinking about the concerns of your customers, as well as the concerns of the traditional competitors. Also the insurers who will be managing your legal risks that you may be entering into, and society as a whole, which includes government. Now, with that overview, I am going to turn it over to Amiri, who will take you through a deep dive into some of the financial implications.
Thanks, Caitlin. When evaluating any business opportunity, the first question that you usually ask yourself is, can this be profitable? And with the sharing economy, it's understandable that you would have some reasonable objections. Sure, sharing has existed since the beginning of time, but with its rebirth now, you're probably wondering, can this actually be profitable in the marketplace? I'm here today to say that the answer is yes, it can be. In the sharing economy, it captures untapped value to ensure sustainable profitability. Now, when we look at the sharing economy, we really put it in the traditional rental market overall in that industry. So PricewaterhouseCoopers took a look at this to see how much of the sharing economy existed in the rental market. And in 2013, they said it was about 5% of the $255 billion market. But by 2025, they estimate that that's going to grow to 50% of that market, so 335 billion out of 670 billion. What is it that explains this dramatic growth? Well, let's break down the business model to really understand it. As I'm sure you know, supply and demand is redefined in the sharing economy. Everyday people like you and I become suppliers in a business in a sharing economy. And sharing is not really the primary motivator for most people, for most consumers that are part of the sharing economy. Consumers are actually after access over ownership. When we think about the example of Uber, they're trying to get access from point A to point B in a cheaper fashion. And me as a supplier, I can easily become an Uber driver and provide rides to people locally in the area. It's a very simple transaction. And we all know that, we probably all have owned a car and know that there's certain responsibilities that come with owning a vehicle. But in the sharing economy, I can get access to that resource without that financial and emotional burden of having owned the vehicle. And those same consumers that are taking over and getting access to that are still looking for convenience and lower costs, just like the rest of the mass market. Now with the sharing economy, it's able to skip the middleman, and it allows for a direct coordination between supply and demand. And with the technology now of the internet and smartphones, that coordination has become simpler than ever. And of course, in the sharing economy, there's a lower cost structure because of the fact that the business owner has usually little to no inventory, and there's less capital investment needed to start up. Let's talk supply. Supply is key in the sharing economy. Supply is the first thing that you have to look for when looking at going into a sharing economy business. As I was saying before, everyday people are easily become the suppliers, and they are the source of untapped value in the sharing economy. They're also the basis of the ability to scale the business. So not just in the community that you're in, but when you're looking for additional markets to expand to, you're looking to identify those suppliers right away. Demand, of course, is still important. We don't forget that. And there's two questions that you ask yourself when you're looking at a sharing economy business. Are you solving the right problem with your product or service? And will that demand sustain the business in the long run? Let's talk Gear Commons. Now, Gear Commons existed from 2013 to 2015 and was an outdoor sharing equipment company. So I could have a tent or a kayak that I could rent out directly to another person, and they could use that and return that back to me. But ultimately, Gear Commons failed. Now why was this? Where did they go wrong in the platform? Well, let's take a look here and see. The first thing is that they were solving the wrong problem. I'm sure we all have busy schedules, and particularly for people that love the outdoors, they have busy schedules as well. And the platform of Gear Commons didn't really help facilitate and help them. It wasn't more convenient than going to a traditional store and renting out equipment. They still had to coordinate the pickup, the drop-off, and returning the equipment, and so it didn't really save them any time. Convenience just really wasn't considered in the equation. And the second problem was they had an unsustainable business model. The fact is that renting out gear equipment really isn't that common. In fact, for traditional stores, it only accounts for 1% of their revenue. In the most case, people just end up buying equipment. And the final part was that when people finally made a decision to rent out equipment, it was usually done on a Thursday for a weekend excursion. So you're only getting revenue one day a week. Now we know that's just not sustainable in the long run. Capturing untapped value. That's the key for the business side of the sharing economy, and it's done by identifying your suppliers first and simplifying their interactions with consumers. The answer is clear. The sharing economy can be profitable, but we know that there's more to it than just profits. We know that there's certain legal and ethical considerations that need to be looked at. So Allison's going to come up and walk you through our legal analysis.
Thank you. We've established that capturing untapped value is going to be key to the success of your sharing economy business. As we shift our focus to the legal analysis, let me remind you of the story that Caitlin told at the beginning of when laws favored horses over automobiles. When something disruptive comes along, it's almost certain that the law is lagging to meaningfully address legitimate concerns. You asked us, can a sharing economy business model have manageable legal risks? We say the answer is yes, and you do that by promoting self-regulation.
As an active part of the sharing economy, you have a lot of areas of law that you need to be familiar with. Stakeholder safety is of utmost importance today, as society is still developing trust in these kinds of businesses. Caitlin earlier spoke to the 1099 economy, which gets at employment law, specifically background checks, and when that line is crossed between contractor and employee. We've talked a little bit about Uber, and Kale will speak more to Uber in our ethical section. But Uber has specifically faced a lot of litigation related to their employment classification of its drivers. We can go into issues of zoning, insurance, and taxes, and we'll be using the case of Airbnb to kind of go through some of these issues. Airbnb is an accommodation sharing platform. It allows me, I have a 2-bedroom condo in Minneapolis, no roommate. I can post that extra bedroom on Airbnb. The next time you plan a trip to Minneapolis, you could find that on Airbnb and decide to stay there, significantly cheaper than a hotel most times. To date, over 60 million people have rented a place to stay on Airbnb. And as Airbnb rose to prominence, grew so quickly, lots of legal gray areas came to light. What does a constant stream of short-term renters mean in the context of homeowners insurance? And should these hosts be required to pay the same taxes that hotels do? Because Airbnb is based on the internet, as are most sharing economy platforms, it's able to scale quickly. And with that growth comes the need to continuously balance competing dynamics of city, state, and national laws. For example, cities such as Portland, San Francisco, and New York have all passed laws saying that either they're limiting the number of nights a room can be rented out, or actually requiring the host to pay those taxes. As Airbnb has expanded internationally, they've encountered other laws. For example, they went into Singapore and then found out that in Singapore, it's actually illegal to rent a private residence for less than 6 months. Most Airbnb rentals are weekends, at most a week. Airbnb for a long time actually said on its website, it's the host's responsibility to be in compliance with local laws. But now some cities are passing rules and mandates saying, no, that responsibility actually lies on the platform itself. Additionally, a lot of the responses to the sharing economy are showing up in piecemeal legislation. We've seen this a lot, especially in Europe. As their economy has been struggling in recent years, they're trying to figure out how to allow sharing economy players to compete with those established and regulated industries that have been suffering. Ultimately, all of this is costly and confusing for growing your business, which isn't good for your bottom line. So taking these lessons that we've learned from Airbnb's examples, what can you do to ensure the growth of your business going forward? As Caitlin said, we have to go back to our stakeholders and look at this from multiple perspectives. Some things that Airbnb could have done is to be proactive as far as educating consumers on how to be in compliance, what hosting means in terms of their homeowners insurance, in terms of the taxes that they're going to owe. Likewise, they could have approached local governments and said, look, this is how we're stimulating the local economies outside of hotel districts by getting more people out into the less visited areas of your cities. They would really be quantifying the public interest that they're serving. And these efforts really get at Airbnb demonstrating that they're not just about the letter of the law, they're about the spirit of the law. And they can use that to their leverage when disputes come up down the road. On this page, I will also conclude with, remember the power of social media. As we know, social media is a part of the sharing economy's rise to prominence. And your society, in some sense, will have an informal way of regulating you as they comment on your business and its growth on social media. Ultimately, what we're getting at here is you are going to want to make business decisions in a way that doesn't encourage further regulation. Self-regulation is going to help you build trust in your regulating stakeholders, and it's also going to help you manage your legal risks. It may sound counterintuitive, but at the end of the day, self-regulating is going to be a whole lot cheaper than litigating. And we know that, again, self-regulating, it might sound like a hard thing to do, but we really think it will speak to the character of the company that you guys want to build and establish. Building on our ideas that you have to capture untapped value, and then we need to self-regulate in a way to manage the risks of our company. We've gotten to this idea of the character of the company that you want to have, and Kay will now speak to this character in our ethical analysis.
Thank you, Allison. Caitlin gave you an overview of what the sharing economy is and why it might be desirable to have a new business in this space. Amiri walked you through our business analysis, showing you that it is possible to be profitable in this new space, as long as you're capturing untapped value. Allison just shared with you our legal analysis and how it's important to self-regulate. Now I'll take you through our ethical analysis. And basically, we want to answer the question that you pose. Can a sharing economy business model be ethical? Our ethical analysis says yes. It is possible through fostering transparent relationships to cultivate trust. Transparent relationships are critical in creating that trust that brings people together for commerce to happen. And to illustrate the importance of trust, let's take a moment to consider Uber. Caitlin mentioned earlier, it's a major player in the ride-sharing space. And you or I could beckon a private car with less time and ease than hailing a cab with a simple phone app. Today, Uber has offered over 1 billion rides globally. However, this company has had some ethical issues. And this really highlights the importance of trust. Several incidents have happened globally that involve Uber drivers sexually assaulting or physically harming their passengers. California prosecutors have successfully sued Uber and recently acquired fines of up to $10 million for Uber not properly vetting their drivers. Another issue is the issue of privacy. In 2014, Minnesota State Senator Al Franken wrote Uber's CEO and requested the company to stop using the GodView tool that tracks customers. Now, Uber reasons that the reason why it uses this technology is to provide customer safety. However, most customers are unaware of Uber's ability to track their every move. Would you do business or continue to do business with a company that you can't trust? Now let me introduce you to the 4 avenues of ethical analysis that we use to look at this problem. This is a higher level view, and we look at the interests, rights, duties, and virtues of stakeholders. With interests, you are simply looking at what are the benefits and costs to the key stakeholders involved. With rights, you're considering what are the human rights and the distribution rights of your stakeholders. And with duties, you're looking at the responsibilities or moral obligations that stakeholders have to each other. And lastly, virtues, you're looking at what kind of character are you portraying with your business decisions. Together, all of these perspectives form the moral insight, which will help you to decide what ethical standards are appropriate for your business. Let's take a deeper dive into each of these perspectives. With the interest perspective, we want to really give the most benefit to most stakeholders. And here, you as investors want to maximize your stakeholders' profit and benefit. Essentially, you want a return of more than average returns for the capital you invested in your business. Your customers want the optimal benefit, which is access to your assets or services that your business provides. Your workers want to control their destiny. They want to be their own bosses, controlling their own schedules. And with this, when you provide access to your customers through the sharing economy, you are fulfilling the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And if you do this, we believe that you have fulfilled the ethical requirement from this perspective. With the rights perspective, you have the right to operate your business under the law. You have the right to choose the appropriate business structure, which dictates what laws and regulations you must comply with. And you have the right to treat your stakeholders fairly and provide safety. Your workers also have the right to operate safely and to deliver on the promises to your customers. Your customers have the right to safety when they are accessing your business, as well as the right to choose your business over others. When we think about duties, it's the moral obligation of stakeholders to each other. So as a business, your moral obligation is really to protect the safety of your stakeholders, and also complying with regulations and laws, as well as ensuring that your stakeholders are treated fairly. Your workers' duties are really to deliver on the promises that your company has promised customers. With the central virtues that will support an ethical business model are honesty and justice. We want to make sure that your business model creates transparent partnerships to create that trust that's necessary for people to do business together. And then also justice, where stakeholders treat each other fairly. And we see this in the example of Uber. Even though they've been tormented in the media, they have tried to come back and provide end-to-end insurance so that a customer is covered from the moment they're picked up to the moment they're dropped off. And they cover their drivers and other people on the road. And this is anywhere in the world. Together, we believe that these perspectives foster transparent partnerships. And the bottom line is that trust is the ethical currency of the sharing economy. You have three very important questions for us. Can the sharing economy business model be profitable? Can you manage legal risk? And is it ethical? And our recommendation, again, is yes, yes, and yes. Yes, you can be profitable through capturing untapped value with shrewd market analysis. You can also self-regulate to uphold existing law so that you meet that legal requirement. And also, your business model can also be ethical through transparent partnerships. You're encouraging your stakeholders to practice honesty and cultivating trust. And this leads to a business model in the sharing economy that is profitable, legal, and ethical. In the beginning, Caitlin mentioned that the first cars were limited to no more than 4 miles per hour because they would spook horses. Well, in the sharing economy and any other innovation throughout history, your sharing economy business model will have some limitations. But we hope that today we've established the groundwork that will help you maneuver these challenges in this exciting space that you're considering for your next business. With that, I'd like to thank you for your time and invite my colleagues up to the floor for discussion.
I'm going to start by asking the first question, and it's one that I kept sitting here and saying, isn't it an oxymoron to say that you're going to self-regulate? Historically, regulation has not been something that one has done over themselves. It's been usually an outside entity, and I'm just a little concerned with what do you see us needing to do as the model or use as the model for self-regulating? talked about Uber, Airbnb, and I think the jury's still out on Uber and Airbnb in terms of how good a job they're doing of self-regulating. So I'd like to hear some more just empirical data in terms of how successful the self-regulated can be.
Well, one thing that we know, we've actually seen Airbnb recently. The CEO has been speaking to media as these kinds of issues come up. And they're really trying to market themselves now as proponents of regulation. Whenever you hear the CEO talk now, so we want to be regulated, we want to be an active participant in that. And that's really what he's doing there, is trying to gain that trust that Airbnb and probably Uber in the same way kind of lost as they initially grew. And so it's taking on that mindset. Airbnb is using that now in order to continue to grow and be successful. But we think if you start with that perspective of whatever industry it ends up being, that zoning laws and tax laws and insurance laws, those apply to me, even though not as clearly as other industries. If you start with that perspective, maintain the spirit of the law, we think that's just going to put you on the level for greater success in the future.
There's also supporting evidence that the government does not want to regulate this industry because they want to encourage growth. And so really for businesses to self-regulate really serves them well as their stakeholders.
If I could just follow up, so when you talk about self-regulation, it's unclear to me, are you talking about, just to take Uber as an example, that Uber would self-regulate, or that the association or consortium of similar providers, such as Lyft and the other competitors, that they collectively self-regulate? Can you expand on that?
We're talking primarily about Uber itself and the individual players as they enter the sharing economy. And an example in this case would be, if we're talking about Uber specifically, one of the biggest pieces of criticism that Uber received, especially early on, was from taxi drivers saying, hey, they're taking advantage of why aren't they playing by the same rules that I have to play by as a taxi driver in terms of the level of insurance that's being carried, in terms of having a taxi license, all of these sorts of things. And so the important thing is, from the perspective of the investors yourselves, as you move forward into this area, you need to keep in mind that you need to approach these opportunities not as loopholes. So it's very much a principle that there are specific laws mandating specific things, but we also, I think a lot of us, you of course have a sense of what the spirit of those laws entails. And so for example, in the case of Uber and taxi drivers, the spirit of the laws related to taxi licensure and all of these things is really about protecting the safety, both of the drivers and the passengers, right? And so Uber needs to think about how can I provide the same level of protection for my stakeholders, and you'll need to keep those same considerations in mind as you move forward as well.
And not just that, but Uber, since Uber is kind of the biggest one, they kind of have to set that stage. So really, since they're so big, they really need to take the onus on to set the stage. So that way other competitors such as Lyft and other ride-sharing services would follow suit, because they're so big. They have to set that stage.
So if I understand your case to us as investors, you're saying it's okay to invest in the sharing economy. Ethically, legally, financially, it makes sense.
As long as you keep these principles in mind.
And are you proposing investing in current entities like Uber and Airbnb, or potentially new entities?
Our understanding was that you were looking to start a new entity, and that you have a team hard at work on identifying where that next great source of untapped value is.
Okay. Do you have any concerns about the sharing providers essentially having a race to minimum wage and deteriorating their quality of life, like taxi drivers doing traditionally better than the average Uber driver?
Well, so just like any market, there are phases of maturation, right? And so one thing that we're seeing, particularly in Australia, for example, is their sharing economy market has actually matured at a quicker pace than it has here in the United States. So what they're experiencing there, for example, is that because the sharing economy has really penetrated the market to a sufficient level, competition is really doing its job. And so the incentive to be a an Uber driver is actually going below what what traditional sector jobs provide, which then kind of solves the problem on its own to a certain extent, where you have a lack of incentive for people to be in this market, and that thus shrinks the Uber's market and returns some of that share to taxi drivers. Does that answer your question?
I guess ethically, there's going to be a set of losers as the sharing economy progresses. I mean, taxi drivers invest a lot of money in those medallions. They have a semi-monopoly, and that's going to be destroyed by the creation of the sharing. On the other hand, they're lifting people out of unemployment and they didn't have a job. So your point about the greatest good for most people probably holds there. In terms of new markets that might be ripe for sharing, do you have an opinion on the either specific opportunities for sharing of something that's not being shared today, or the characteristics of something that might be a good candidate to be shared?
One thing that we've talked about, so of course supply is something that is key in this area. One specific industry or item that we've identified as having room for improvement is college textbooks. That's something that is that students typically have a difficult time finding textbooks at a reasonable price. Just like the taxi medallions were under the control of a select few. Publishers have something of a similar monopoly, and students are kind of held hostage to the publishing of new editions year after year. So we see that as a market that has some potential for disruption.
And as far as geographic markets go, the sharing economy has just sort of gotten into China, and obviously you have more than 1 billion people in China, and promoting access is something pretty new in their economy. But the sharing economy has taken off. Actually, I think there are at least 3 accommodation sharing platforms that are bigger than Airbnb in China. So there's definitely opportunity to go in there, even in some of the areas where there already exists ride sharing and accommodation sharing. There's a lot of room and a lot of growth going on there right now.
A lot of your commentary continue to invoke the theme of trust. As a professional investor, typically in the IPO space and even established companies, public companies, trust is, it seems to me, intrinsic to any sort of business undertaking, business engagement. How does the concept of trust in the context of the sharing economy differ from a Fortune 500 corporation?
A huge part of that comes down to the fact that it has this peer-to-peer element, and the prevalence of social media really makes it all the more. So many platforms have actually turned trust into a currency, the way that we described it. Airbnb, for example, if you do not have a sufficient rating on Airbnb, you will not receive any business. And so it's become quantified in some ways through a lot of these platforms where people are providing instant ratings about their experiences. And so the minute that someone has a negative review, if they don't immediately respond to that negative review and resolve the issue, it will cause immediate and serious damage to their business. And you didn't have that level of transparency with a lot of the traditional competitors, the way that you have in this peer-to-peer market.
And we're at a particular time too, as we mentioned, with the recession, and a lot of things came out that certain big companies were doing certain things. You know, it was that need, that want to return to the simple peer-to-peer platform. But again, once you return to that person becomes successful, starts a chain, starts multiple businesses, then it kind of turns back into a bigger business as well too. So it's the kind of thing where it's very cyclical, I would say.
Do we fully answer the question that you asked about the taxi drivers before? I just want to make sure that we got it.
Your presentations didn't mention any concept of losers. I was just trying to think through who's going to be hurt, and maybe that's just a fact of life, or maybe there's some way we could consider that.
And actually, the way that you just said it, I think the idea that it's a fact of life and a fact of competition is a really good one. I think that there are few people, except for that select few people who held that majority, I believe there was a medallion king in New York City that he was known as. Except for those few winners, there were a lot of losers already. And actually the losers under the current established taxi system in a place like New York City, a lot of times were the consumers that were, and the drivers that were also subject to heavy regulation and sometimes extortionate treatment from the holders of those medallions. So I think that this is actually, much like we talked about with the example of the automobile, it certainly is disruptive, but I think a lot of it is positive.
Well, there's another set of losers in the Airbnb example, which is the people who live there full-time are annoyed that the unit next door is now a constant, it's a hotel. And it didn't used to be like that. So it's noise, it's nuisance, it's people that don't respect the property. So it kind of degrades the overall housing environment where those units have gone in large numbers, which is why they have these laws now that counteract them. But on the finance, I have a finance question too. What percent of the success of the sharing economy do you attribute to either tax avoidance or law avoidance, or the fact that they're just not playing out the same rules as the more established regulated entities in those spaces?
Actually, I was going to ask you if you could state that again.
Sorry. Let me rephrase. If the sharing economy companies had to play by the same set of rules that the hotel operators and the taxi companies and others that are regulated, they pay taxes and insurance and employment taxes because they're employees, not contractors, would they be as financially successful as they are today? Or is the lack of those things really magnifying their success financially?
I think that that can help them as they get started, as the idea is coming to life and they're growing quickly. But as we kind of got at, it's fine to start in that foundation. You can grow really quickly, but then you have a much bigger mess to clean up down the road. And I think that can impact your profitability down the road. And so that's why our recommendation is starting off on that foot of spirit of the law, developing trust, so that as you grow and get to that point, you have a smaller issues to deal with as you're in that significant growth stage.
And then naturally, as human beings, we don't necessarily want to try a hard route. We look for the easy route to start something, or something that could be very great. And so we know as the law struggles to catch up with certain things that are happening. I mean, if I have a room that I want to rent out and all of a sudden I make an internet platform for other people to rent out, it doesn't seem like it's a big deal until it scales to the size that now it's like, well, now it feels like it's a hotel. So it's really a gray area where you kind of find a gray space and you can scale it up, but then at some point you hit that tipping point, and then now how are you any different than a hotel? So I feel like there's not really an easy answer to that because the law is so gray.
I think it's too soon to tell, because with China, they have growth of the middle class and millennials traveling more now. 10 years ago, there's only like 1 million people traveling on the holidays. Now there's over 100 million. And so with Marriott, even with Airbnb out there as a competitor and other big hotel chains, Marriott is going in and partnering to be able to offer their lower cost brand like Fairfield to the Chinese market. So they don't feel threatened by the shared economy.
They're offering that on a sharing platform?
No.
Oh.
They're offering that with partnerships with Chinese companies.
They're doing
the franchises.
Yeah. So the growth of the sharing model isn't driving out traditional competitors. There's room for both to play in this space.
Almost by definition, and you, Mary, used the term, it's a gray area. I mean, there's a lot of gray in the sharing economy simply by virtue of its emergence.
Yeah.
Right? How do I, as an investor, quantify the risk of the unknown, from whether it's legal regulatory risk or just something, an unintended consequence, such as multiple units in an apartment complex suddenly being transformed into quasi-hotels? How do I get my arms around that as a prospective investor in an incipient business model concept?
One way to get started in that is looking at what the traditional competitors are facing. So one of the risks for Airbnb is that should legislation suddenly declare that we have too many people complaining about the room next door being let out constantly, that maybe legislation will come down and catch up to the sharing economy, and your business might be subject to the exact same level of taxation and regulation and require the same level of insurance. And so by looking at that quantity, that's sort of a huge part of that's one way to quantify the risk that we're looking at, is that event. And if you And this is where we say that, where we believe that these principles are really essential to making sure that your profit is sustainable, because this is the surest way to prevent against the realization of that risk that you would be subject to all of these costs that the traditional competitor is subject to as well.
And I think businesses need to pay attention to what risk can be shared by stakeholders and what risk they should be morally obligated to provide, such as safety for their customers and drivers.
Is the ethical criteria by which we evaluate the moral probity of a company, does it differ in the shared economy versus a traditional business framework? And we'll just stay with Uber and model. Should a driver for Uber have greater rights to decide who he wants to pick up as opposed to yellow cab in town here? And you all know the issues of redlining or the like. And early in one of your slides, you made reference to the female-owned Uber. She only wants to pick up women, and that was an issue that I read about just the first time this past week.
Yeah.
What about the principle of freedom of association? And I can understand why women at midnight might only want to pick up other women, but is that a problem? And how does the new business enterprise address that? And the possible legal consequences? Here, at this point, my question is longer than
Can you repeat the initial part of the question, please?
How does legal or ethical responsibility differ in a shared economy context such as Uber from the rest of the world?
I do think we go back to the idea of access versus ownership. A lot of the participation in the sharing economy from both sides, consumer and the contractor or employee, is voluntary. Obviously, it's voluntary to become a taxi driver, but there are those standards as well. And the Chariots for Women is the Uber rival that has just emerged. It's only female drivers, only female passengers, and children under 12 is the rule for that. I do think, whether or not that's going to work out is yet to be seen. Again, it goes back to the supply and the demand. We don't know exactly what's going to happen with that.
What percentage of Uber drivers are women today?
That's an excellent question. I think that's one we'll have to look up for you. Yeah.
Probably about the density you need. A certain
But as far as this example that you're speaking of, what's to stop Uber from adding a button to its app saying, I only want a female driver?
Well, there's legal issues there, right?
combine that.
Sure, exactly. And both Uber and Airbnb have had issues with drivers and host profiling guests. That has come up, whether racially profiling or Americans with Disabilities Act, those have come to light. I think we had some headlines up, and that has to be addressed. It goes back to the issue of how are you going to make sure that your safety and those rights that are protected under the law are protected.
If there's no more, I'll finish with one, probably not a question, but a statement. You talked about the self-regulating, and I wonder, where is the stakeholder of the consumer being considered? Because most consumers look to an outside entity other than the owner to be the regulator, because we know who they're typically going to be in favor of. And I think that leads to one of the reasons why there is so much government regulation of some of these things. And I just raised that because I think it's a very interesting question. And where does the consumer fall down in this equation in terms of being a stakeholder?
So one thing that we got at, we talked a little bit about how in a lot of these, you rank your Airbnb host, you rank your Uber driver, but a lot of these platforms also have abilities for the hosts and the drivers to rank their guests. And so it goes both ways in the sharing economy. And you kind of get a reputation on these platforms for how good of a guest you are. And that's not necessarily the case in the more established businesses. They've never had a way to rank your customers in a way that's going to follow them. And to get it, when we apply the ethical analysis, particularly to looking at that stakeholder of the consumer, we see the sharing economy as just another way that we're furthering the consumer's right to choose. That another option has been created for them, and that it is in their best interest as they are seeking to obtain access at lower costs.
We could go on with this all that leads me to when we do the evaluation of these customers in several of these different models, there have been negative evaluations that have resulted in rather large suits because sometimes the negative evaluation can pretty much shut down a person's business. And that if they're the self-regulator is sitting there saying, you gave my business a negative evaluation, they're not willing to shut that. So it kind of gets to be a pretty good type of war. Interesting topic.
Yes.
Very interesting. Thank you all very much. Job well done. We'll give you some feedback.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for your time. Yeah, sure. Will the feedback be now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Let me just start with saying, very difficult topic for me. If you didn't recognize in my past when I said I was Commissioner of Occupational Professional Licensing, I regulated 225,000 licenses in the state of Maryland. And the one example I will give you was probably the hardest license to regulate for us was home improvement contractors. Because there is a market, there's absolutely that need there. And there are a lot of people trying to fill it, but they're not licensed. And the problem we ran into was when you have an unlicensed home improvement contractor doing work, something goes wrong with them, there's no recourse for you, the consumer. If you have a licensed contractor and something goes wrong, you come to us. We have a fund, we make it whole. And they can no longer be licensed. So it's a good give and take both ways. And at one point, I even thought, when you start talking about the growing economy, be careful, that could lead to some political issues. Because on one side of the political spectrum, they say it causes a growing economy. On the other side, they say, put a lot of people out of work.
I'll just make an observation about presence, which is so important in the business context. And I was actually quite impressed with the comfort that you conveyed. You made the audience feel as though you were confident in your position, you had a message to tell, and I think that came across quite effectively. And I know that we have cautioned you about relying upon notes or reading a script. There was never that sense. You integrated, I thought, very effectively your PowerPoints that reinforced the theme that you were getting at, and you could speak on the call. It appeared to me to be spontaneously. Not sure you went through your presentation once or twice, more than that. But I thought your business credibility really came across quite effectively.
Yeah, I thought you guys did a great job to a person presenting, so you were good public speakers, that's great. On the slides, a couple of nits, there's a preponderance of small logos that shifted all over the place. You had these section slides where you introduced the new topic, legal finance, and on that slide, there was a St. Thomas logo and an IBECC logo. On the other slides that weren't those slides, there was this little cloud logo, and then down the bottom it said IBECC, and then across the bottom where there was this section, there was another cloud that moved with the section that we're in. Yeah. That little cloud is unnecessary, because then when you put up some content that had a cloud icon in it, now I'm looking at 3 clouds. That's just visually too many little clouds. On the finance side, I was wishing we'd see some unit economics comparing traditional business to sharing. So a taxi versus an Uber, a hotels.com versus an Airbnb, either from the consumer side or maybe from the cost side of providing that service. And then when I asked you about the characteristics of potential sharing businesses, I'm a practicing venture capitalist, and I'm about to write a check into a sharing economy company. and it has to do with trains. And you wouldn't think about this, but the business of moving coal around the United States is very expensive. A coal car costs $150,000, and they sell them on 10-year leases, and there is no train rental business in the world today. So this company is going to allow people who are on 10-year leases to take their idle trains and sublet them to others on a 2 to 6 week basis to just basically do one route. Anyway, big market, no competition. The characteristics are capital intensive. I wish you had said that. You didn't mention textbooks, and from the point of view from a college person, a $200 textbook is very expensive. So I think one of the driving characteristics is expense or capital intense. Makes the sharing of that asset. It works with jets too. Jets are really expensive, so sharing a jet makes a lot of sense. But overall, I think you did a great job.
Thank you.
And I'd like to commend you on one thing. I've seen 3 presentations today. You are absolutely the best at staying in role. You stayed in your position, what you were doing, and kept us in the role that we were in. The other two have at times slipped our role. And I wanted to really commend you on that because I think that's very important. If you go to a corporate board or to an investment board, they want to make sure that you're constantly aware of who they are, who you're speaking to, and what we've asked you to do. So you did an excellent job of that.
Thank you.
Great. Good job.
Thank you very much.
Good job.
Thank you very much.